Audio.
We have these energy leaks as climbers on routes. The average climber is closer to the fire hose of wasted energy than they are to the drip of wasted energy.
Hey y'all, welcome back to The Struggle. It's me, Ryan. I hope you're having an awesome day and an awesome week. And wow, here we are, smack dab into spring. Some absolutely splitter conditions out at the Red River Gorge just recently. I was out climbing yesterday as I'm recording this, and it was like one of the best days of the year out there. One of the best days for me to be dogging it on a rope because the fitness is not there. If you've tuned into the recent plog that I put out a couple days ago, if you're a Patreon member, even for free Patreon members, you can get access to the plogs there. You hear all about where I'm at. I'm stronger than I've ever been. I just PR'd like all of my strength assessments, but I am definitely among the least conditioned that I've ever been, just with regard to like climbing endurance. But that's why we are here today. We've got GOAT Coach Eric Hörst back on the pod. Oh my gosh, how spoiled are we? We had GOAT Coach Neil Gresham last week, and now we've got Eric Hörst this week. They've got like a combined 60 or 70 years of coaching expertise, and they're climbing harder than all of us. So give it up for the GOAT coaches. And Eric today is bringing a deep dive into endurance training. Ooh, this is a topic I'm excited to dive into and really explore in a lot of different ways over the coming months, because I am going to really embrace the struggle and get into some steep, deep, pumpy climbing at the Red. I sent the boulder project and I'm like, okay, well now what's going to push me even further outside of my comfort zone? And that is getting into the Madness Cave at the Red River Gorge. So we'll see how that goes, but I can tell you how it's started, and that is me feeling insanely intimidated and overwhelmed by that style of climbing. And that tends to be a good place for me to start when I'm setting goals. So I am embracing the psychological discomfort, but now it is time to embrace the physical discomfort by getting deep into some endurance training. And Eric really brings the goods, as he always does. He is an absolute expert in endurance physiology. He's an endurance climber himself, and it is so impressive to see him tie in and just rest his way up insanely hard routes. And he's going to get very prescriptive in this episode, not just about the physiology, but also the mental side of endurance climbing, and then the exact protocols, the training that we can all be doing, whether you want to climb more routes in the gym, more routes outside, have big days up in the alpine, or if you're just into bouldering, have more high quality goes in a session. So just a really useful and fascinating conversation for you today. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my stuff on the backside, but let's just go ahead and embrace the pump right now with Eric Hörst. The idea for the conversation is, of course, you and I got out climbing a few days ago. We could talk a little bit about my climbing, but I really want to zoom out, if it works for you, and have a Professor Hörst, a kind of mini masterclass here on endurance training and just the endurance energy system. Since for the listener, you and I have talked about this, of course, but for the listener, I, of course, just finished off what was a very much a strength and power focused block for the last 8 months, where I was focused on predominantly on bouldering or short bouldery routes at the Red. And having just accomplished the V8 goal with Bulldog, I kind of have this sick idea of swinging the pendulum the exact opposite way and taking on a route in the Madness Cave and really focusing on endurance. And what will that take, essentially, to go from where I'm at to a Madness Cave route? But again, we can touch on me, but I'd like to, for everybody who's listening out there that also wants to climb a lot of routes or build a lot of capacity to do a lot of boulders in a day, make this applicable to the general listener and not just me on my journey to whatever comes next for me in my own personal pursuits.
Yeah, that sounds good. And, I think, your journey that you're on is not unlike what a lot of climbers experience or are, involved in. Is, they have a kind of a bouldering season or a period that they get really excited about bouldering or kilter boarding, or maybe they have an outdoor boulder project. And then, at some point they maybe tire or need a change of pace and they switch to rope climbing and, of course, a more endurance oriented activity than bouldering. And so, over the long term, in climbing, I tell climbers, don't think in terms of weeks and months, think in terms of years and decades, because climbing is a sport you can get better at, not only technically and mentally, but also physically. The adaptations that occur build and accumulate over decades. And so someone, your age or my age can still train up at least some aspects physiologically. I mean, there's other things that do wind down, obviously, later in life, like pure power. I am losing at age 60. And so I'm kind of training to maintain what I have, whereas a younger climber is training to gain. But endurance is something that you can build for years and decades. And it's actually more complex when you really dig deep. And I don't want to get too deep physiologically today, but it's easy to have a conversation as a coach and a client kind of on a, high school level, let's say, when it comes to endurance training, and just kind of keep it simple, stupid approach. And that works for most climbers. But, the more trained you get as an athlete, then detail and nuance and really digging a little deeper and doing, some novel approaches become more important if you want to continue to improve. And, again, route climbing is more of an endurance sport. I mean, certainly you need strength and power for crux moves, but overall, especially climbing at the red, you fail on a route, it's more often you're pumping out. You don't have the capacity to complete the route. Whereas bouldering is more anaerobic. It's a brief burst. Typical boulder problem could be 10 to 30 seconds. Maybe a longer boulder could be as long as a minute. But that's really in the sweet spot of, where you're being powered more anaerobically than aerobically. And so, if you're training for just bouldering, it's quite different than training for just route climbing. And then there's, again, a lot of people do elements of both. And that means you need to, over the course of, let's say, a year, be able to program something that can help you maybe peak at one time of the year for a bouldering experience and then peak another time of the year for a route project. And that's kind of like what you did. The past several months have been dedicated to Bulldog, doing your first V8, which is so amazing, Ryan. I'm proud of you. And I was, as a coach, kind of trying to be a bit of a reasonable skeptic when you set that goal early on, because you had never bouldered over V4, I think.
Right.
So that was a big goal to set, but you proved it can be done. And, now you're kind of satisfied, you achieved that big goal, and you're thinking more about maybe 513B and what could be even beyond that long term. And so, I guess that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the props and the support look, the first day that I had on Bulldog was with you. You and I went out there and pulled those first few moves, and you really got an appreciation for the beauty of that boulder, its setting, and also
And difficulty. I don't think nobody can detract from what you did, because you did the legitimate start. I know that's something that, I don't know if you've ever discussed it on your podcast, but there's kind of an ambiguous start depending what online guide you look at. And you definitely did the legit V8 start. So, nobody's going to be downgrading what you did. That's for sure.
Well, thank you.
Again, great job, Ryan.
I appreciate it. It really, that means a lot to me. And it was just such a proud send, and also a very enlightening and fulfilling journey for me to push myself out of my comfort zone to take that on. As you know, one of the biggest points of discomfort for me in that whole process was that my heart is very much in these long Red River Gorge routes. And I just had such a challenging time putting the rope away for a long time, but it forced me to find love in movement that was very kind of outside of my comfort zone, and these limit moves and the nuance that comes with limit bouldering. And so I'm really glad that I did it. I at first I was wondering, like, hey, did I blow it? Did I make a really bad decision doing this? But I can now say with absolute confidence that in hindsight, I did not blow it. I learned so much about myself, and now I'm piping strong. But as you saw when we were out at Torrent Falls a few days ago, I am very unconditioned, if you will. All the moves feel easy, but putting a handful of bolts together is quite hard. And there's nobody better that I could be talking about this and that the listener could have here as a guide to building incredible endurance than you, because as I witnessed when we tied in, classic second go Hörst doing well, I mean, you can always do a lot of volume of routes, but you can do a lot of volume of routes up near even your red point limit. Second going 12C steelworker, then second going on a separate session, as you just reported to me, 12D Racer X over there after doing a bunch of other routes. So how do we, as the listeners that want to be able to climb a lot of routes in a day with quality, or me, want to try to push my top end, if we're looking at flower power, 13B or 8A, that's a limit grade for me. It's a grade that I haven't touched yet in the madness cave. How do we start looking at building that endurance system or power endurance system, or however you want to look at it? If we've got a decent bouldering base and maybe a decent fitness base, I might have there somewhere down locked up inside of me, some endurance still in my body, but what's the big picture? And then we can maybe start even narrowing it down to smaller pictures. But for me, I'm looking at fall. So, we've got whatever that is, 6 or 7 months. That's not years. How should we all start looking at building that endurance?
Right. Well, again, endurance training, there's many facets to it, and there's a wide range of adaptations that occur and contribute to exemplifying endurance on the rock. And, the first one I always have to start with as a coach is, most people don't utilize their strength and their, what capacity they have to the utmost effectiveness on the rock because of technical flaws and over gripping and moving too slow and fear and anxiety, that builds, that compromises your technique and your fluidity of movement. And so first and foremost, if you want to have endurance climbing routes, you need to climb routes. So someone going to the gym and kilter boarding 3 days a week, they'll build strength and power and the ability to do, hard, try hard movements, but they're not building endurance. You build endurance by, climbing, a lot of volume that is lesser intensity. And, by going outside, you kind of kill 3 birds with 1 stone. You get the technical workout and you get the mental training, building the confidence and, knowing when to really step on the gas on a red point and when to let off the brake. That's all experiential stuff. You can't, training in the gym doesn't really teach you that. You need to be on the rock to learn that. Those types of, improvements, the technique and the mental side of thing, they happen incrementally and you accumulate them over years and actually decades. And I think that's, I'm a veteran climber. I've been doing this for almost my, whole life. And I actually physiologically, if you tested me, my endurance probably isn't that great, but I know how to use what I have super effectively on the rock because I've been doing it so much. My eyes and, my proprioception, how I feel on the rock is so fine tuned that I know like, oh my gosh, this hold, I need to be off of it lickety split. Whereas I hit a little finger bucket, it's like, okay, I can take a couple of breaths, chalk up, and, knowing what to do on any given hold and how quickly to move and, your hip positioning and center of gravity, all these technical aspects, the stuff you do in the gym doesn't really help so much on that. You need to be on the rock. So, recommendation number 1 for the listeners is try to get outside as much as you can and accumulate the technical, the mental, and the physiological gains that you can get from being an outdoor climber. Now, realistically, we all have lives outside of climbing, jobs, families, school, other activities that we're passionate about and involved in that prevent us from being outside maybe as often as we'd like. And so that's the beautiful thing of home walls and climbing gyms is being able to at least get a fix, get a workout that is climbing specific. It's more specific than, going for a run or a hike or, lifting weights, which there can be some value in those activities, but it's not rock climbing. But going to the gym and putting on a rope at the gym is the next best thing to putting on a rope outside. Because, although the playing field is much different in a gym, the holds are less unique and, they protrude, they're easier to see. It's easier to climb fast in a gym than it is climb fast outside because you really have a map laid out for you on a gym route. Whereas outdoors, everything is much harder to decipher. And until you actually touch the holds, you're not quite sure what you have. So, it's not, the gym's not a perfect replication or replacement of outdoor climbing, but it's the next best thing when it comes to, building route endurance and movement efficiency. So that's the first major thing that anybody that's serious about improving their route climbing, you need to put a rope on. And I love kilter boarding. I love the other stuff you can do in a climbing gym, but and some climbers, I think they go to the gym and they're resistant to putting on a rope because that's something you do outdoors. You go to a gym and you do the other stuff. And yes, that's in certain situations, that could be enough. But if you're really serious about route climbing, I believe you need to be on a rope a couple of days a week. And if it's not happening outside, it needs to happen indoors. So, that's kind of the starting point. And indoors, when you have the rope on, it can't all be climbing bolt to bolt and, projecting indoors just like you would do outdoors. When you're indoors, you need to be thinking about accumulating volume of climbing. When I do a route climbing session indoors, I partner up with somebody that wants to achieve, do the same thing as I do. And then we swap leads and, we do a lot of submaximal climbing. That's 1 or 2 number grades below our limit. So if my limit's mid-range 13, I'm doing a lot of stuff in the gym that's 5'11" and up to maybe mid-range 5'12". Stuff that I can on site, or maybe if I fall once, I can second go. And, that's kind of where the sweet spot of training is. Because if you're going bolt to bolt and projecting indoors, then you're basically bouldering on a rope at that point, because you're never or not as often connecting it all together and climbing, with a fluid nature and briskness from bottom to top. And, the typical climbing gym, the lead routes might only be 50 or 60 feet long. So what I like to do is, climb the route once, lower off, untie, pull, tie back in, and climb again. So I call that doubles. Do a double send. That gets you more kind of a stress that is maybe 8 to 10 minutes long, is a little bit more like an outdoor duration or length of route. And then after I do the double on the route, I take my shoes off, I switch with my belayer, and he does his double. And in the course of an hour or two, you can climb a high volume. Again, it's below your limit, but it's, you're hitting that sweet spot of building climbing specific endurance and also refining movement efficiency and, learning to climb, through hard moves and, getting used to clipping quickly and when your forearms are getting pumped. All those things are at play outdoors. And so, you need to replicate that indoors. And so again, 2 days a week on a rope. It could be 1 day outdoor, 1 day indoors. It could be 2 days indoors, 2 days outdoors. Something like that should be the starting point. Now, there's other things we can talk about above and beyond that, but that's the starting point.
This episode is sponsored by our friends over at PhysiVantage. By the way, PhysiVantage has been a sponsor of this podcast since the very first episode, and that's because I sought them out. I've been a fan and a paying customer of PhysiVantage since long before there was a Struggle Climbing show. And why would that be, Ryan? Well, because it works, y'all. Their products are made by climbers for climbers. They are science-backed, and then I have just been testing them on myself, a guy in his mid-40s just trying to get after it and level up day after day and year after year. And the PhysiVantage products have really helped me to feel better on and off the rock. My favorite products that I take every single day are the greens. I have those every morning, and I'm telling you, I'm getting sick way less than I ever used to, and I've got 2 young kids, so that's saying a lot. And then I also take their supercharged collagen before every single workout, whether it's a finger training or a climbing day, and their protein. I have their vegan protein or their whey protein, usually once a day, sometimes twice a day as like my little treat. Their chocolate flavor is like out of this world. I'll mix it in with plain Greek yogurt for even more protein, or I'll just shake it into some cold water. It's just that good. I love everything they make, and I love how I feel. If you want to push yourself in your training and in your climbing, I really do think PhysiVantage is going to make you feel better. And if you want to get a discount, you can use code STRUGGLE15 at checkout to get 15% off your order. That also helps to support me and the show, which I really appreciate, and all of that information is in your show notes. Hey, I'm really psyched to say that Arc'teryx has come aboard to support me and the podcast, and I just couldn't be more excited because Arc'teryx, as I'm sure you know, is just one of the most well-regarded, highest-performing brands in the outdoor space, and that is evidenced by their athlete team, many of whom we've had on the show here. Friends of the show, Jonathan Segrist, Drew Ruana, Amity Warm, Jordan Cannon, so many more out there are crushing it in Arc'teryx gear. They take really, really good care of their athlete team, and they take the best care of me and everybody else who wears Arc'teryx gear because this stuff holds up. Right now, this is a podcast, so you can't see what I'm wearing, but I am wearing the Delta Half Zip pullover. It's bright orange. I'm sure you've seen me in my interviews and climbing in this thing. It is crazy soft. It's crazy lightweight. And I'm also loving right now, kind of in these spring, summer temperatures where we're going to be getting some rain if I'm hiking into the trails or I'm going for a little adventure with my family. The Gamma lightweight hoodie, super, super soft. It's super comfortable. It's got a hood with a little visor on it. It packs really small. Everything that Arc'teryx makes is just of the highest quality. It lasts forever. They've been doing it for over 35 years. They love climbing and I love them. You can learn more over at their website. You can hit that link in the show notes or swing over to thestruggleclimbingshow.com/Arc'teryx. Well, I appreciate that you began with these harder to kind of prescribe and pin down, if you will, elements, including mindset and fear and how that can lead to overgripping or, a leaky bucket of technique, and then technique itself. And so before we do a deeper dive into energy system training or just endurance training, kind of on and off the wall, continuing where you've started with the 2 days on a rope, I would love to press you for technique, whether they're kind of red flags or common mistakes or just things that you have noticed over the years that have been incredibly important for not having the leaky energy bucket when going up and route. Because it is very clear to me when I've climbed with you for years now, when I watch you climb, the efficiency of movement's incredible. And I notice this with others that I climb with. I often climb with guys and women who are more accomplished climbers than myself. And there's a fluidity and an efficiency of movement that I notice when I catch them that either isn't fully there when I'm climbing myself or I watch videos back of myself doing it, or if I go out with climbers who are maybe not quite yet to the level that I'm climbing at, maybe they're 5'10" or 5'11" climbers that I can notice kind of a stark difference, but I'm not able to put my finger on it. I just notice, I'm just like, oh, that's not as efficient of climbing. And so for those who are listening right now, and then including myself, are there anything that stand out technique-wise that we should be aware of and that maybe we could even work on consciously, whether we're at the gym or outside?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things as a coach you can look at. And, something you mentioned there, and I think it's very helpful for any climber, is to more often shoot video of yourself doing lead climbs. Set up the camera on a tripod, get the video, especially of, maybe you can't capture the whole route, but capture the main, chunk, the more difficult part of the climb, so that, when it's all said and done, you can get home and kind of look at things, ideally on a bigger screen where you have more detail to observe what's going on. And, not so much compare yourself to other people, but just, kind of learn to be a self-coach and have kind of this mental dialogue about like, what am I seeing in terms of sloppiness? Skidding feet or feet popping off of footholds, or, the hallmark of one of the hallmarks of an efficient climber is what I call quiet feet, feet that are placed precisely, they don't move and the movement up the route continues. And it's this very precision placement of feet versus, a lot of climbers, or not a lot, but, lesser experienced climbers, their feet tend to be noisy. They, might be slipping off of footholds. They might not be moving their weight over their feet properly. You tend to see more tightness above the waist in the shoulders and the arms, and the feet kind of trailing behind, skidding around a little bit. And those things, when you're on the rope leading, it's hard to be self-aware of all those mechanical things. You're worried about doing the next move. You're not thinking about assessing your foot placement quality. But the video analysis can allow you to do that after the fact. Or if you're, working with a coach at a gym, which is a beautiful, great thing to do, is actually have the coach as your belayer while you're climbing, and they can, work with you on the spot and help you see what's going on. But yeah, signs of energy leaks, skidding feet. I like, pace is so critical, especially on routes that are past vertical. You're on a slab, the pace can be very slow because you're standing on your legs, and you can really, oftentimes you have to move very slow to kind of nuance the smearing, and, the handholds might be terrible. So you spend a lot of time feeling around for, what is the proper hold when you're on a slab. On a steeper route, you grab, what you believe is the proper hold or the sharpest or most in-cut hold, and you proceed with the next move. It's a really quick thing. And the steeper it is and the smaller the holds, the quicker it has to be. When you get on a small hold, I think instinctively, a lot of people slow down because they grab that bad hold, and all of a sudden they're thinking to themselves, they're doing an assessment on how bad the hold is. Like, oh my God, this is a bad hold. How about just do the move? Especially if you've done the move before, don't think if you know it's the right hold, grab it and go, instead of doing this, going through this internal dialogue of how bad the hold is. Or same thing with the feet. If there's a very, subtle foot placement that is critical, like say in a crux sequence, place the foot, feel the placement. And then if you say anything to yourself, internal dialogue, I say execute. That's very pointed and helps, direct you to move on, rather than, you don't want to think as you're putting your foot on that bad hold. If you think, oh, don't slip, don't pop, then you're thinking about a negative, and you're kind of priming yourself for that exact outcome.
Right.
So again, these are all things that you have to practice, and it speaks to, as climbers, as human beings, we have this constant internal dialogue. We may not verbalize it, but from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, you have a conversation in your head. And so what is the nature of that conversation? And if you're up on a route that you have been on before, whether it's once before or it's a well-learned project route, get up there, and the dialogue should be relatively quiet, and it should be encouraging and kind of upward focused. Words like execute and keep moving, and so that's a critical thing to work on. And it's hard to coach, because how do you, as a coach, put yourself inside the head of the climber? So the best I think you can do a lot of times is have this conversation, get the climber more self-aware of needing to monitor their internal dialogue. That's a healthy thing to do in all of our life activities, is to be more self-aware of that internal dialogue. And a lot of us, depending how we were raised and just our life experiences that we've been dealt, that internal critic could be quite loud and prominent. And that's unfortunate, and can certainly hold you back in a performance-oriented activity, whether it's something at work or school or rock climbing. And this all speaks to mental training, which is a whole other can of worms, which we won't go into here. But mental training is perhaps the most overlooked type of training that there is among climbers, but it's highly important, especially for route climbing, where you have the fear of falling and potential dangers, and on top of just needing to perform optimally. So energy leaks, pace is critical. And so when you get on small holds, when you get, to the hardest moves, execute briskly, don't hesitate, because, think about time under tension. When you grab those small holds, every second that you're on there, you're using ATP to maintain that grip. So if you hit a grip and you're on it for 7 seconds before you do the next move and get off of it, well, then you've used up 7 seconds of ATP that, if it's anaerobically derived, is a finite resource. Whereas if you can get off that hold in 3 seconds, you've used only less than half as much ATP on that hold. So being brisk is critical to your endurance, your ability to make the most of that finite anaerobic endurance, anaerobic reserve that we have. And, that accumulates move over move. I spoke at a research conference in Chamonix, France, I don't know, 6-8 years ago. And I did a video analysis of Adam Andra climbing Silence and Margot Hayes climbing Biography, two very notable ascents. And they were very common in that, their climbing on their routes was bimodal. Either they were at a rest position where they were recovering, shaking out, could be a jug, a good hold, could be a knee bar. On Silence, there's a couple of knee bars. They're either resting or they're climbing briskly. There's like no in between. It's either full gas or rest. And when you broke down their time under tension on handholds, it was 2 or 3 seconds. So now, again, these are elite level climbers on really hard routes, but they're grabbing small holds and they were gripping the holds for just 2 to 3 seconds each. I challenge you, dear listener, videotape yourself and, look at your stopwatch or your iPhone and see how long you grab certain holds. Now, again, if it's a big hold, you can hang on it longer and you can think around and survey the playing field and shake out. But if it's a small hold where you're trying hard, at 80% or greater of, let's say, your peak finger force, or if you sense that you're pressing the gas, you need to move. You need to go quick, get on and off that hold. And, the better climbers are faster climbers. And we haven't even talked about the actual training, the physiological adaptations. And that's a huge can of worms to open up. So I don't know how much you want to go into that, but
I want to go into it a lot. That can of worms is a delicious, they're gummy worms, they're twin snakes. And I would love to go into that because I think, again, it was very wise of you as a coach to start with the lesser tapped, lower hanging fruit for many climbers.
And you hit the nail on the head, Ryan, because, so many climbers, they go to the gym 3 days a week and pump them, they get on the spray wall and climb till their forearms explode.
Right.
And they perceive on a very elementary level that this must be the best thing for me to train for the red because I get pumped, my forearms explode when I'm on, a limit project at the red or at,
right.
Name your favorite steep sport crag. So they think just going to the gym and getting pumped is the answer. And there is some benefit to that. There are some adaptations but it's limited. It's not an endless, accruement of endurance gains from just going to the gym and getting pumped. It's part of the formula, but there's so much more. And if you're wasting energy, that seems like where you ought to start. Like if you're on a sinking ship, first plug the leak, right? And so we have these energy leaks as climbers on routes, and even the best have them. I mean, they're drips. With an elite climber, the leak is a drip. And for non-elite climber, it could be, a fire hose of wasted energy. And I would argue that the average climber is closer to the fire hose of wasted energy than they are to the drip of wasted energy. And so hopefully this, the listeners, this compels them to reevaluate what aspects of their mental and technical game are contributing to that fire hose and how can we clamp that down and reduce that to a garden hose first, and then to a trickle, and then hopefully, maybe a decade from now, we can be a drip. And, that should be the first, because that's where the easy money is at. When it comes to the physiological adaptations, when you start training endurance, like any training program, the first few weeks you get gains. It's a beautiful thing. You start a fingerboard program, you start a weightlifting, any program you start, the first 4 weeks, you improve. But then after that, the improvement slows down, and that's where you really need to have a coach and a program that is more sophisticated.
Well, no doubt. And I think that to put a cherry on that first chapter, if you will, of the endurance training that we're talking about, the mental training as well as the technical training, an experience that I had when I came out to the red, just for the listener, was that everything felt so hard because I was so scared. And I spent a full year really deliberately working on my fear of falling and taking big whips into space. And one of the things that I can tell with friends that maybe I'm getting into climbing or have been climbing for a while, but haven't been doing a lot of lead climbing, is that an experiment that I run with them and that I often run on myself as well. And so you listeners could run this yourself, whether you're at the gym or you're outside. If you can get on a lead route and maybe it's hard and you do a couple takes, and then you get on a top rope and you float it, you didn't get more fit. You didn't even probably get better at climbing. You just got less scared. And so you climbed with more fluidity and confidence and speed than you did when you were on lead. Or if you get on lead and you climb it once and it's really hard, and the second or third or fourth time, you're just kind of cruising it. Again, you didn't get more fit. You just learned the route. So you're able to climb it with more efficiency and more confidence and more ease. And so that's
100%.
typically the case. I mean, that's what I experience as well. And so if that's happening, then I mean, you can expand on it, Coach, but I feel like we're not gaining any sort of fitness or strength in those moments. The only thing that's changing is that we're somehow more comfortable, and that's translating to better performance.
For sure. For people who project, we see this a lot. If you give your project 4 goes in a day, maybe the first go you're not fully warmed up. And so it does kind of serve as a specific warm up. And, the second go, you are more tuned in to the moves and you're more, physiologically warmed up and ready to go and confident, but you might not send. And then you do a third go and maybe you do a fourth go. And by the fourth go, you're definitely, there's not a lot of gas left in the tank, but sometimes the route gets sent on the fourth go of the day. And so how is that? Like you just said, you didn't just get stronger on the fourth go. You were just way more efficient. Or how about this? Maybe you don't send on that day, but you come back the next day, and the next day you wake up and, oh, my forearms are sore and, I feel drained, but yet you go warm up and you send the route on day 2. Like, you're not stronger on day 2. You don't have more endurance in day 2 because it takes more time than 24 hours to recover from what you did day 1. So that's just evidence of how powerful becoming a more efficient climber is. And yes, it's about technical efficiency, but it's also all the mental stuff. And, what you pointed out about fear, and that's something I still at times deal with. There's certain routes that have situations that kind of freak me out, and I need to go up bolt to bolt and kind of wrap my head around, the scenario and what the falls will look like, and maybe even take a couple of the falls. And then you kind of put that to bed and you can climb without thinking about that. But for newer climbers, it's a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle that takes oftentimes years for someone you just don't learn to comfortably take whips on lead in a year. That's pretty rare. It's a process. And you can begin that process in the climbing gym and fall in a very safe setting, a relatively safe setting. Outdoors, it's a little, more variable and there's more opportunities to potentially get hurt falling. So I don't want to ever make light of taking falls, but you can, on many routes, take very safe falls, and kind of it's only through falling and kind of, that you conquer the fear, or at least tamp it down so that you can operate more effectively on routes. And so, for newer climbers listening who are still struggling with the fear of falling, know that the fear's never going to go completely away. You don't want it to go completely away because that's, what's keeping you alive in certain situations. But you will learn to be able to control the fear and analyze the situations that you're feeling fear. Is it a situation that fear is legitimate and it needs to be heeded and you need to, mitigate the risk, or, maybe do something to manage the fall dangers? You can analyze very often, especially here at a place like the Red, where you're falling just through air because it's steep. You can quickly dispel the fear, like on a route like Tuna Town or anything on Undertow Wall. It's hard to imagine getting hurt on that unless your belayer would botch it somehow.
Right.
And so you can go up and really climb free and relatively fearlessly, and therefore be very efficient, more efficient. And, if any listener or viewer wants to really see what efficient climbing looks like, watch a video of Alex Honnold free soloing, because you can't free solo effectively if you're inefficient or harboring fear. Yes, there are times where Alex will probably stop on a route and evaluate different safety things, maybe even the ambient weather conditions, how the grip is. And there could be elements of fear there. Obviously, if he's free soloing, you don't want to fall. But if you're free soloing with fear in your mind, you're in the wrong game. You have to, because you can't be efficient. You can't climb smoothly and untethered. And so, you look at a veteran climber, and especially a veteran free soloist like Alex, and you see just the hallmark of efficient climbing. It looks easy. That's how efficient they are. They make it look easy. And as opposed to a climber who is very tight and not so fluid on the rock and is harboring fear, you can see, hesitation on certain moves. And, again, the pace gets slower and slower as they, get fatigued. And really,
Right.
as you get fatigued, you should be going faster and faster. You should be pressing on the gas pedal harder. But it's a process. It's a learning process. I reflect back on when you were working the force, Ryan, and that was a big part of you sending the force, was becoming so familiar with the route that there was no fear. It was just down to executing and getting a little quicker and a little more efficient each time. And you kind of wear down a route, especially those endurance routes, those resistance routes, you wear them down. Of course, you're building yourself up as you wear the route down. And you trust the process that the route's going to go down, and it does.
To the listener, I'm going to link to Eric's book, Maximum Climbing, which is a fantastic read and covers all of the things that we just talked about in incredible depth with great examples. And so if you want to tackle the mental side.
On the mental domain, yeah.
Yeah, the mental domain. If you want to tackle the mental side of things, that's a great starting point. And I'll link to some other resources that I like for that. And we've had past conversations on the subject as well. But let's utilize the next half of our conversation here to talk about the nuts and bolts of training. And for somebody like me, a weekend warrior, where maybe I can get out to the crag once a week if I'm lucky. And of course, we've got summer coming up here at the Red River Gorge, so we'll see how long even that cadence is able to last. A lot of my physiological preparation for sending my hardest sport route this fall will be done at a gym where I've got either access to boulders, ropes, and auto belays, or at home, where I fortunately have incredible access to some great tools. Now, the common tools that many climbers are going to have will be a hangboard and some weights, and I've got a force board force gauge, but then I also have an adjustable kilter board, and now a tread wall, which is in pieces in my garage still because I made a promise to myself that I would not put it together until I sent Bulldog. So now I have the reward of being able to put this tread wall together. So I understandably, then probably compared to many listeners, I have more tools in my home than many people will, but a lot of people will have these tools at their gym. And so we can look a little bit specifically at what my journey could be. As we're recording this, it's just about May. And the time to try to be performing in the Madness Cave is going to be October to December. So it's not a ton of time, but how could we break down for myself and just any general listener, if we're doing those 2 rope climbing sessions a week, as you mentioned at the beginning of this, as kind of the table stakes, what else can we/I be looking at to try to build that Eric Hörst bulletproof steep sport climbing endurance in a half a year?
Yeah. There's kind of 2 levels that you can look at endurance training. You can kind of take the 100 level discussion, which would involve just go and do a lot of endurance climbing. That's the obvious thing, because it's working the mental, technical, and the physiological aspects. That's the 100 college level discussion we could have on endurance training. Or then there's the 400 level where you get into more physiological energy systems and how to program them over the course of weeks and months to bring about kind of a peak for your fall season. And I guess the place I want to start is, there's 2 types of endurance physiologically. There's aerobic endurance. That's where ATP is being generated in the mitochondria in your muscles from utilizing oxygen that's received through blood flow. And then, those fibers, which it's primarily slow twitch fibers that have the high mitochondrial content. Those slow twitch fibers are utilizing glucose, fatty acids, and even lactate, which we'll talk about in a moment, as the substrate to, along with oxygen, crank out virtually an endless supply of ATP. And that's a beautiful thing, because that aerobic endurance system can function for many minutes, actually many hours continuously, though the intensity, the amount of ATP that is generated, the rate of ATP production is modest and can only support a modest intensity of exercise, whether it's running or climbing or, whatever the sport is, but it can sustain it for a long time.
Right.
So, you go climbing for a whole day, or you go on a big wall, or you multi-pitch climb, or you just go to your crag and do 8 or 10 pitches. What's enabling you to do those 8 or 10 pitches is primarily the strength of your aerobic energy system, because it's what's producing the bulk of the ATP. Again, it's a virtually endless supply. Now, the other type or category of endurance is anaerobic. And anaerobic endurance is more a function of how long your fast twitch fibers can operate at a high intensity. You call on your fast twitch fibers when you're doing things that are closer to your limit, whether it's a sprint, if you're a runner, or a boulder problem, or a crux sequence as a route climber is more anaerobic than it is aerobic. And so a good training program, it needs to train both types of endurance, and ideally kind of in separate sessions. That's where I've been I think 10 or 15 years ago, I was really the first climbing coach to talk about energy system training and how we can use that as a conceptual model for more accurately training different traits, physiological traits, and doing it in a cohesive and intelligent way to bring about performance gains when it comes to the physical side of things. So in any case, when you are going to the gym, you need to ask yourself, okay, am I training today primarily aerobic endurance, or am I training primarily anaerobic endurance? Because they're two different things. You might think of a car, a hybrid car. I don't know if they still make many of these anymore, but years ago that they were a thing where there'd be an electric engine that ran off a battery, and there would still be a gasoline engine. And the gasoline engine, as long as there was gas in the tank, would propel you for as far as you wanted to go. But the electric was battery powered and was finite. When the battery runs out, the electric engine's not functioning anymore. So think of the anaerobic energy system in our bodies as that electric engine, the battery having a finite charge. Once that charge is gone, it needs to be recharged before there's, electric capacity back to run that electric engine. But the gas tank is big, and as long as you can keep pumping gas into the tank, you can drive across the country. And so the aerobic energy system, which has tremendous capacity in the human body, is like that gasoline engine. As long as you're eating food and breathing air, you can make ATP via the aerobic energy system. But the anaerobic system, it's a finite capacity. There's only so much glycogen inside your muscle cells to be utilized. And there's a tiny amount of ATP and creatine phosphate resident in the cells that can be utilized. But once you blow through those, which happens relatively quickly, it needs to be regenerated or recharged, just like that battery in the car. So in any case, you need to go to the gym and say, am I training, aerobic today, or am I training anaerobic? And if you just go to the gym and just climb till you're pumped out, well, you're training both. Okay, that's not worthless. There's some value in that. The guy going to the spray wall twice a week and just climbing till his forearms explode, there's some training of the anaerobic endurance and some training of the aerobic endurance, but I don't think it's optimal. Okay. Again, I'm not dismissing that spray wall, pumpy climbing has value, but there's, higher value and more long-term gains with a more intelligent approach. And that more intelligent approach actually involves 3 things: doing occasional workouts, frequent workouts that target specifically the aerobic energy system, doing some workouts that target the anaerobic endurance energy system, and also doing at least once a week a maximum strength or limit strength power workout, which is actually anaerobic alactic. And you might say, why is that important if I'm talking about endurance? Well, it's kind of foundational. How strong you are provides kind of a ceiling for how much endurance you can build underneath it. And so even for someone who does no bouldering, they're just a route climber, there is some value to doing at minimum one strength, max strength, power oriented workout a week. You need to be able to grip a hard hold on a crux move, but beyond that, it helps establish, again, kind of a ceiling to which underneath you can build endurance. And there's a lot of exercise physiology that I won't get into involving the brain, the central governor in our brain, this black box that regulates how hard we can express strength and power and how long we can endure in severe conditions. Your brain's trying to preserve the health of your body. And so it will dial things back. And so some of the training we're doing isn't necessarily bringing about physiological adaptations, but it's actually changing our brain's perception of fatigue and what we can tolerate before we would die. And the brain always wants to stop you way before that, but you can recalibrate that over time. And that book, Maximum Climbing, talks about just that. But, that's one of the adaptations that it comes about as a result of training. So I've gone a lot of different directions here, but, the bottom line is when it comes to effective endurance training over the long term, it's just not one thing. It's, a variety of things that all contribute to exhibiting and expressing more endurance in the rock. And so for you, Ryan, you're coming out of this bouldering phase with perhaps more strength and power and limit move ability than you've ever had before. So by all means, let's try to hang on to that. And, so use that kilter board at least once a week, get on a hangboard, do a little bit of campusing, those things that you are familiar with, I'm not recommending 3 days a week of that anymore. We're shifting you into more of an endurance focus, but 1 day a week, absolutely. You want to hang on to that high end and try to maintain.
As you noted, I've kind of got the anaerobic alactic taken care of, and I'll maintain with one kilter board session a week. So now, let's get prescriptive. If I've got 6 months to try to get into Madness Cave Fitness to try to do my first ever 13B or 8A, and the demands of that kind of climbing in there, it's very steep and very continuous. What do you think? So I've got one kilter board session a week. What else should I be doing? And does it change over the next 6 months, or is it going to be a fairly steady structure of aerobic and anaerobic endurance workouts?
It will change, but it will change mainly in the last month before your performance season starts. So if your performance season begins, let's say October 1st,
sure.
Then for the month of September, we would change things up a little bit. But between now and then, you're going to be, and I don't want people to misinterpret this, but you're going to be kind of like a runner training off season. Like, their race season is 6 months away. They're doing their off season race training. And again, climbers and runners were two different creatures, but I'm just kind of saying conceptually about how, one similarity would be when you're 6 months out, you're trying to build capacity, and capacity is built through trying to increase, the volume of submaximal activity that you can do. In the case of a runner, we're talking miles, how many miles they do in a week. And so they might build miles week over week and month over month. They might start off at, 20 miles a week. And then, a month later, they're 30 miles a week. And a month later, they're 40 miles a week. They're building mileage, they're building capacity. And so that builds all of the things that relate directly to the aerobic energy system, which are mitochondria mass, capillary density, which is very critical for delivering more oxygen per unit of time to the working muscles. In the case of a runner, it's the lower body muscles. In the case of a climber, it's more so the upper body and the forearm muscles, increasing, the vascularity of that. And we're speaking primarily not about the big vessels you see popping out of our forearms, but the capillaries, the microvasculature that delivers oxygen and nutrients to slow twitch fibers in our forearms, our climbing muscles. And also, by the way, your heart, strengthening your heart is important. It's really important to a runner, that stroke volume, how much blood that heart can push through your peripheral system, your circulation, your extremities, runner's legs, climber's arms. It all comes down to that beating heart. And the more forceful that heart, it's called stroke volume. Your heart is a muscle. So the stronger it gets, the more blood it pushes per beat. And that pushes more blood through your forearms per beat, which gets more oxygen per beat into your forearms and more metabolic byproducts flushing out of your forearms per beat. So building a stronger heart, obviously critical for a runner, also critical for a route climber. And that's why the best route climbers out there do some actual running, because, to build a stronger heart, yes, climbing endurance activities stress your heart, but not as much as actually going out and running or doing aerobic activity like, swimming, biking, running. Now, I'm not saying we should all be marathon runners. Absolutely not. That would be a bad training program for climbers. But doing a little bit of running, again, I know pro climbers, you go back to Lynn Hill, one of the most legendary and incredible climbers to ever climb here on earth. She was a runner. Probably, I haven't talked to her lately, but I bet she still does some running or at least hiking. So a strong heart's critical to pushing blood through your body effectively. So dabbling in some running would be a good rest day thing for climbers to do. It's not like the number one thing I would have a climber do, no, but it's something like if you have the time to program it into your schedule, it will actually feed back and contribute to aerobic energy production.
Can we talk about the programming then? I would love to. So if I've got 7 days, that's what everybody has. And let's say one day a week, I am going to try to get out to the red and get on routes. So maybe not in August, but I'll get into the climbing gym and get on a rope or whatever. But let's use that as our jumping off point. We got 7 days. And so between now and September, and you said things would change a little bit the month before I want to start performing. So in this off season, as you note, how would you program these 7 days for me?
Okay, so I think 4 days a week, you should be doing climbing activities. You need to climb to get better at climbing. So 4 days a week, you're going to climb. Now, what are those climbing days made up of? Well, again, one day could be a kilter board day where you would, by the way, as either part of your warm up or, maybe as part of a 2-a-day structure, you might include some hangboarding or edge lifting or, max strength power type exercises.
Sure.
So that's that 1 day of maintenance of the kind of your high end, your alactic energy system. Then one day, I think as kind of this, again, pre-season or off-season mentality, only one day really needs to be a heavy duty anaerobic lactic session. That's, the power endurance, the really pumpy stuff. So if it's a day at the red, that's a day that you're on hard stuff that it's really working you and, you're getting pumped, you're, really expressing yourself near maximally when it comes to the anaerobic endurance energy system, anaerobic lactic energy system. If you don't get out, let's say it's a 90-degree week and you're not going outside, or it's a rainy week and you're not going outside, well then, one day in the gym, you would be doing, kind of those power endurance exercises or protocols, like, 30 intervals on your treadmill once you have it set up, which is a power endurance protocol. Bouldering 4x4s. On your kilter board, you can do 4x4s on there that are sub-maximal. If V8 is your limit on the kilter board, well, then climb 4 V4s back to back with just like a 30-second rest in between or a 1 minute rest in between. So that's kind of a kilter board version of a bouldering 4x4. Spray wall, you get on the spray wall and go really hard, all out 1 minute burns in the spray wall with like 4 minutes recovery in between. And you do that 8 or 10 times. That's an anaerobic endurance kind of workout. So one of those a week, one of your maximum strength power workouts a week. And then the other 2 days would be the aerobic training. Because again, this is your off-season training where we're trying to build that aerobic energy system, that gasoline engine that we talked about, that when you go climbing this fall season gives you that capacity to have a long, productive day. And that's where you need to be very targeted with what you're doing. For a few years, I've been talking about, you listen to these podcasts on training and exercise physiology, and the zone 2 training is a really big thing where you go out for a run or a swim or a bike and you're going for that zone 2. Now, in aerobic activities, you can kind of calculate those zones by heart rate. For climbers, it doesn't work out so well because our heart rate is so much more chaotic because we hold our breath on certain climbing moves. Like when you're running, biking, swimming, well, maybe I take swimming out, but running and biking, you're not holding your breath. You're breathing at a steady pace. Your muscles are very cyclic. There's constant blood flow. But in climbing, we grab holds hard. We occlude blood flow. We occasionally hold our breath when we're trying to create core stiffness for a move.
Right.
And all of those things lead to our heart rate being very chaotic. If you run a heart rate monitor while you're climbing, I have my Whoop, and so I can go back and look at my heart rate after doing a climb, and it spikes. It's very spiky. Whereas in a runner, you don't see that. Maybe they run up a hill and it increases, and then they run down a hill and the heart rate backs off. But you go out for a zone 2 run and you're kind of, okay, I'm going to run at 130 beats a minute and maintain that for 45 minutes. That's really hard to do climbing, just because, again, climbing is not as cyclic and consistent of a thing as running and biking are. But it's the zone 2 equivalent, which is climbing well within yourself, where you're not feeling like desperate ever. I like to use a scale of perceived exertion is maybe the best way to communicate it to the average, climber, is you're seeking to be climbing at an intensity of between 6 and 8 on an intensity scale of 1 to 10. So 10 is crux moves, all out climbing, when you're bouldering at your limit, that's a 10 out of 10. 9 is a little submaximal. 8 is moderately submaximal. So like at an 8 out of 10, you might be getting a bit of a pump, a moderate pump, but not a pump that's growing and is, getting out of control. Mm-hmm. It's when you're climbing at a 7 or 8 out of 10, you're getting a light to moderate pump that is just kind of maintained and is under control. And that is where you can kind of trust that you're fully utilizing your aerobic energy system. So those mitochondria, those factories in your forearms, your climbing muscles that are making ATP, they're operating maximally. They're cranking out as much ATP as they can. And maybe there's a little bit of anaerobic glycolysis contributing some ATP that is, producing a little bit of a burn and a pump. But again, it's not getting carried away. And, so what zone 2 climbing is seeking to do is to climb at an intensity level where you kind of are finding that threshold between where the aerobic energy system is fully utilized. And the only way to really find that is to dip a little bit into the anaerobic, where you start to feel the pump and start to feel the burn a little bit, just a little bit. And if you're there, then you've kind of fully tapped what the gasoline engine can produce in terms of power, and you're beginning to draw on that battery a little bit. But you're not going full to battery. You're not going full gas and battery combined, which is what it is when you're going at your limit.
And this would be like, for example, I know we talked about this when I was preparing for the force. So like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off on the tread wall or on routes where you're recovering quite a bit between goes, not fully. So you're going to be kind of carrying a bit of that fatigue or pump through. But I think you had me doing, if I recall, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off for somewhere around, I think I started with maybe 8 sets and I got up to maybe 12 sets or something like that as I built some fitness over time.
That is correct. But it's all about, when you're doing 2 on, 2 off, to keep it primarily aerobic so that you're not going deeply anaerobic, you need to be climbing on a lot of big holds and not a super steep angle, because you can go 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, and the 2 minutes on, like you barely survive the 2 minutes on, like you just squeak it out. And then the 2 minutes off, you're breathing heavily. If you're breathing heavily, you went deeply anaerobic, because what you're paying back is you're paying back this oxygen debt. When you're anaerobic, you're making ATP without oxygen. Well, when you rest, you need to repay that oxygen to bring about the recovery of the anaerobic system. So when you're breathing heavy, you went very anaerobic. So the intensity between 6 and 8 out of 10, subjective effort. Breathing should be not labored, but steady. Go for a zone 2 run. It's about steady breathing. It's not about, getting out of breath.
Right.
That sprinting makes you out of breath. Again, you have to repay this oxygen debt that was created by a lot of anaerobic lactic energy production. We're not going there if we're training properly with the aerobic energy system. So 2 on, 2 off, as long as you're not panting and as long as you're not redlining. So the key is you don't redline. You need to keep your wherewithal and be able to dial things back. And so I like on a tread wall. On a tread wall, you can just move to larger holds, or on a spray wall, you can just move to larger holds.
Right.
And try to keep that intensity where it needs to be. And then the 2 off is total recovery. You can walk around the gym. You want your heart beating and your blood circulating, because you are, whatever lactate you have generated, you're going to circulate it around your body, and your body actually can utilize it in slow twitch fibers to make ATP via the oxidative energy system. And it can also, you circulate the lactate back to your liver, where it's turned back, gluconeogenesis turns it back into glycogen. So this whole thing that lactate's a bad thing is the stupidest thing. I mean, that's this dogma out there in this bro science, like, ooh, lactate's really killing me. Lactate is fuel. It can be used. It's created by the lactic energy system and utilized by the aerobic energy system. If you understand how to train these things, you can use lactate to your benefit. It's the acid part of it that's bad, that drops the pH inside of the cells and basically shuts down energy production. It's that the governor, again, that central governor in your brain, it notices that pH is dropping from the hydrogen ions, and, it shuts you down. And, that's when you flame out. And so again, if you're training the aerobic energy system properly, we're not going there. We're not making a lot of hydrogen ions. We're not getting out of breath. We're not getting deeply pumped. If you're getting those outcomes, or if you're experiencing that physiologically, then you're training the lactic system. And there is a time and a place to do that. But the better time to do that is that last month before you segue into your performance season. So again, 5 months out, you want to be training up the aerobic energy system. These long-term adaptations, to make new capillaries doesn't happen overnight. It happens over the course of years of aerobic training. To make more mitochondria, now mitochondria are fairly plastic. Those factories for ATP, they're relatively plastic. Those factories can be more efficient and actually bigger over the course of just a few weeks and months of training. But long-term, over years, you continue to make the factory, it's like Amazon warehouses. They can just keep, those Amazon warehouses are massive and they just keep multiplying everywhere, and that's kind of what the mitochondria are. And, to grow them takes years. And so, world-class marathon runners are almost all, between 28 and 40. They're not people that started running 3 years ago, because they need those physiological adaptations that take years to accumulate. And so, again, becoming a good rock climber, a lot of complex stuff going on mentally and technically, but when you just get down to the nuts and bolts of the physiological requirements, you need to build a lot of capillaries and a lot of mitochondria, and you build that through sub-maximal volume climbing. That is a big part of the program. So think of it as base training for a rock climber, is putting in your mileage. So right now, I would say you want to be doing 2 days a week of that base training, of that aerobic, climbing specific aerobic training. And you can sprinkle in a few days of jogging and running if you wanted to address the heart.
Right.
Because on rest days, that's almost like a recovery type activity. But in terms of the lactic system, I think it's still good to do 1 day a week. Okay, even during this, this off season, so to speak. And so that 1 day a week might be if you're out projecting and you're getting severely pumped and you're experiencing all those signs of going anaerobic, heavy breathing, burning muscles, exploding forearms. Those are all signs to a climber that you've gone deeply anaerobic. And so 1 day a week of that would be fine. And if you're not getting outdoors, well, then that 1 day a week could be doing the bouldering 4x4s or the 30-30 all out intervals on a tread wall. And, so on those days, you're targeting, 8 and 9 out of 10 or 8.5 to 9.5 out of 10 on intensity. That's where you really recruit that, utilize that anaerobic lactic energy system.
Well, this kind of threads the needle for me because you know me, and it's very easy for me to understand, which I appreciate as being somebody who's quite busy in my regular life. Let me push you with a thought experiment here, because you've prescribed 4 climbing days, a limit bouldering, 2 of the zone 2, and then 1 of the kind of anaerobic endurance there where we're doing maybe 30-30s or 4x4s. So that's 4 climbing days. And then I'll have some stretching and some general cardio on the, off days, or if I'm going to do 2 a days because I got to wake up early and I can do some elliptical or some rowing or something like that in the morning before getting the kids to school. But let me push you for a thought experiment, because a lot of climbers that I talk to have 3 days a week where they can get to the gym. So what one of these exercises or these days, if you will, that you've prescribed to me, could I do on a hangboard at my house or combine with a different day if that's not too much volume or something like that, or potentially eliminate if I have to? So you have 3 climbing days you can play with, Coach, but then there is a 4th day where I could do like a hangboard something.
Right. Well, I mean, the day that you're doing max strength and power and like a kilter board, like most people don't have a kilter board at home like you do. They would have to go to a gym. So, that could be, the whole kilter board thing could be expendable. You could just do a hangboard at home. If you're doing a max strength protocol, you would do weighted pull-ups. You would do a several exercises that elicit near full recruitment of your climbing muscles. And that would serve kind of as that one day of, anaerobic alactic focus. Again, I'd prefer if there was a little bit of limit bouldering sprinkled in, because then you really start to draw the core and everything else, and your body's working in unison to elicit full strength and power, versus just, you're doing max edge lifts or max hangs. It really comes down to, you're tightening your shoulders down and you're tightening your core down, but it's not much of a workout except for your finger flexor muscles.
Could I do some limit bouldering and then do some 2 on 2 off or some route doubles at the gym, or is that too much?
I was just getting to that. I mean, that's what I do. Is I will do, when I'm in a home training block, I'll on a single day do a double workout. And so the double workout could be, a hangboard, maybe around lunchtime, I'll do a max strength workout where I'm doing weighted hangs, weighted pull-ups. I have a campus board at my house, so I'll do some campusing. All of that with a very thorough warm-up. Might be a 90-minute workout that I do at home. And then in the evening, 6 p.m. or so, I would, do the aerobic climbing workout. Again, for me, it would be on a tread wall doing like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. Again, between 6 and 8 intensity on a scale of 1 to 10. Someone, has access to a climbing gym, maybe they do that hangboard workout at home in the morning, and then they go to the climbing gym and do their volume, sub-maximal volume, zone 2 climbing, as we're calling it, at the climbing gym in the evening. Because if you're really putting together a comprehensive program, you do need to start doubling up some things. And we haven't talked, by the way, Ryan, about, there's still some reason to do a little bit of like antagonist muscle training with like free weights, shoulder presses with dumbbells. I'm a huge fan of. We do all of this pulling. We need to work the opposite of pulling, which is pushing. And, I think most coaches are with the program on this whole thing now. And we're not talking about a bodybuilder's program where you're doing heavy weights and you're trying to bulk up. That would be counterproductive. But what we are doing is building strength, mainly with the nervous system adapting to provide more strength without bulking up and making the fibers bigger, because bigger fibers are heavier fibers, and we're a weight sensitive sport. So a little bit of new muscles, not a bad thing. I'm not saying that, but you look at elite climbers out there, they don't look like bodybuilders. They look like a composite of like a runner and a gymnast kind of together. They're muscular, but they're kind of muscular in a climber way or a gymnast way. So, but in any case, just for injury prevention, to help maintain balance and longevity as a climber, shoulders are precious things, that a lot of climbers blow their shoulders out at some point. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but some of it is just anatomically, they're not functional. They've got really strong lats and really weak pecs, and you got the hunchback, and their shoulders just, they're very strong on internal rotation and they're weak on external rotation. We need to be more balanced as climbers if you want to be, have longevity and reduce injury risk. And so to put in 2 brief workouts a week that address those pushing muscles, and they can be done on rest days from climbing. That's probably when they should be done, because if you're doing some dumbbell presses, some bench presses, some internal, external rotation, maybe you have a sling trainer, you're doing some I's and Y's and T's, those types of exercises that you can largely do them at home. You buy some dumbbells, you buy some free weights, you buy a sling trainer. You could do those as home workouts, which is what I do. So those can be done as part of a 2-a-day as well. You can do, a climbing gym workout, and then later in the day, or maybe first thing in the morning before work or school, you do your push muscle workout, which you can do a push muscle workout in 30 minutes. You don't need a 90-minute workout. If you're spending 90 minutes lifting weights, then you're not doing a climbing weight training program, really. You're doing something that's more voluminous than that. You can throw in a couple of deadlifts. I'm a fan of deadlifts for posterior chain strength, and that contributes to our core strength. Being able to connect small hands and small feet on the rock is, hip extension is something that climbers tend to be pretty weak at. That's my experience. So introducing some deadlifting, you need to have proper form. You might not have the equipment at home to do that, but a lot of climbing gyms now have just enough free weights that you could go in, and as part of your warm up or your cool down, you could throw in a few deadlifts. And again, nothing crazy. You're not trying to do set PRs or anything like that. You go down a rabbit hole. I've done that. I went down a rabbit hole in deadlifting about 10 years ago because I kind of got hooked on seeing the gains, and I ended up getting a hernia. So then I ended up having to get surgery to fix a stupid hernia because I was trying to deadlift 350 pounds. Why do I need to deadlift 350 pounds? Ego, or just because it's there. But, we're climbers, we don't need to be setting PRs on bench press and deadlift. That's what powerlifters do. So, it's, again, we can have personalities. That's an attractive thing and we can get sucked into. And I've seen that happen to many climbers, but it's not a wise investment in time, and it just might get you hurt like it did with me. And then we had mentioned earlier about running. I'm not saying climbers have to run, but if you're a route climber in particular, I think it's something you should consider because, again, a stronger heart makes you a better route climber. For bouldering, probably not necessary. If you're a boulder specialist, if you never put a rope on, then, the stroke volume of your heart, it would be a nice to have more, but it's not going to be game changing on the rock.
Right. Yeah, a little more capacity to be able to train more, have more quality efforts on a day. But hey, if you're a straight up boulderer, you probably didn't listen to this episode anyway.
That's true.
And Coach, man, I got my work cut out for me. I really appreciate, you always bring the science and the thoughtfulness, but also the prescription of what I'm going to be setting myself out to do. And anybody who's listening who wants to join me on this journey, let's stay in touch on it. I'll be sharing, but I'm going to be getting to work here for the next 5 months.
Yeah. Well, one more final comment, and I know maybe we'll talk again 3 or 4 months from now, but that last month of September, before you go into your performance season, which is the autumn, that's when you probably dial back and remove one of those zone 2 climbing days and add in a second anaerobic lactic session. Because when you're transitioning from kind of base training season to performance season, one thing you need to spin up is these soft adaptations that relate to anaerobic enzymes and buffering of hydrogen ions, that those adaptations take place from those more pumpy lactic focused workouts. And we don't need to do more than 1 a week of those now. But when you get to that last month where you're ready to transition to performance season, that's when we change the program up a little bit to give you a few late in the game adaptations that will help you perform your best when you're trying to red point at your limit. And so I know that wasn't the goal to discuss that transition today, but I just did want to make the distinction between what you're going to do, May through August will be a little different than what you're going to do in the month of September as you transition, and try to prime for peak performance the fall season. So again, we're thinking about the next 4 months as kind of, an off season base building, trying to not lose high end, trying to build capacity. And then that last month of training before your season, we change things up a little bit to get things to peak for performance season.
Oh, I'm so excited, Eric. This is going to be great. Okay, well, the psych is always high over here at The Struggle and with you as well. We will connect. We will connect over the summer or as the fall approaches so that we can talk about dialing in that nuance and certainly getting more project specific for me. We'll do another Road 2 episode. But for those who are listening, this has been a masterclass in how to build endurance and not just physiologically, but also the mental side that we started this conversation on, I think is incredibly valuable so that we have a more efficient engine as we're climbing. Eric, I really appreciate it.
And one more thing, this whole, over these next few months, it's nice to have in the distance what the target goal is. Have you set the route yet? Have you picked the route like for your fall season? I know you mentioned, 513B as being a target, but have you picked the route yet?
I'm very close to, by the time this has come out, I might have decided because I'm going to go back out and get on it tomorrow, but I'm really loving Flower Power in the Madness Cave. It's a 13B Chris Martin route. And I have been on it once, although I didn't make it to the chains. It gets pretty hard up in that steepness.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty inspired by it. What do you think? What do you think by that route or any others?
I think it's a great pick. I've done that route. I think it's fantastic. And I think it's a step up from the force for sure. Yeah. And, I've never heard anybody say it wasn't 13B, so I think it's a legitimate, route. And, it's actually a route that has enough shade that you can dabble on it, during the warm weather. So that's not a bad thing to start learning the moves, this summer if you get out a few sessions on it and then come, September, October, get to work.
I'm really excited. I'm nervous and excited in equal parts, which always tells me that I've picked a pretty good goal. And well, you'll be along for the journey. I really appreciate it, Eric. I'm super excited by this. Let's get to work.
Well, all right, you heard the coach. It is time to clock in and get to work. No shortcuts on this one. I just created my endurance training plan for the next few months using what Eric's laid out in this one. I put it into my new app, which we're going to be launching soon. I know I keep teasing this new app of mine. I've been using it for months. It really helped me to get focused and disciplined and accountable to ultimately send my project, the Bulldog Boulder. And then now I am programming my next round of goals and training sessions around that. And anyway, we're going to release that app pretty soon here. But I've got my endurance training now programmed into there. And as you heard, I'm going to be following Eric's program. 2 days a week of that kind of zone 2 climbing, 1 day of more power endurance, punchy climbing, and then still 1 limit bouldering day for me on my kilter board. I've still got some goals on that board that I am very close to achieving. So yeah, we can do it all. I think we can do it all. I don't know. We'll see. Check back with me in about a month and see how my forearms are feeling after I get into this. But I am going to try to ease in, and I'm really excited. I'm really excited about kind of the linear progress one can make when building endurance in this way. And as Eric said, it can go for decades, long into our 50s, 60s, 70s. You can see people out there absolutely crushing endurance routes. So wherever you're at with your climbing journey, I hope this was really helpful. And building some endurance and capacity, whether we're bouldering, sport climbing, beginner, intermediate, advanced, that's just going to help us to have higher quality training and climbing sessions, which means our technique will improve and we'll hopefully have less of those energy leaks in our system. I really enjoyed that part of the conversation too. So yeah, Eric, thank you as always for bringing the expertise, bringing the science, bringing the experience to this conversation. Very, very grateful for it. I'm equal parts nervous and excited about this goal and getting into the madness cave. And for those listening, I did a recent blog episode where I talked all about my experience on flower power. I've now put in 2 sessions on that route, just trying to explore it. And God, it is definitely the hardest thing I've ever climbed on, like just in terms of going bolt to bolt and feeling the holds and the moves and the steepness. It is the hardest thing that I've ever set my hands on. And so that's exciting and also super, super scary. So we'll see how this journey goes, but I'm just getting started on it right now. And I'm going to get to work in the gym and out in the red as long as the temperatures provide, and then just at my house here. I'd love to hear how your journey's going. If you're getting into some endurance training, let me know what you're working on. Maybe we can trade notes. You can find me here over on Patreon, on Instagram, all the things. And speaking of Patreon, that's how I make this show happen every week. Shout out to the sponsors, and I'm really, really grateful for the amazing sponsors of The Struggle. So Arc'teryx and PhysiVantage for this episode. Thank you guys so much. Could not do it without you. And of course, PhysiVantage is Eric's company, and I've been using it for years, long before there was a podcast. I was using PhysiVantage products to help me achieve my goals on and off the rocks. So big shout out to them. And then Arc'teryx, they just make the most incredible gear, as you probably know, and it lasts forever. And I just got this new harness that they just released, and it is feather light, so comfortable and incredible. I'll talk more about that as I put more reps into it. But man, good stuff coming out of both of those companies. So thank you to them, but also thank you to you. If you are a Patreon member or you've been a Patreon member and considering it, there's no obligation. You can sign up for a month or 2, get access to over 150 hours of bonus content. So videos, pro clinics, bonus episodes, all that stuff. And also it helps me to do this, to make this show week after week. And it's a lot of work. So yeah, thank you for helping me to keep the lights on over here in the podcast/utility closet. There's a link right there in your show notes for Patreon if you want to check it out. There's a free trial too, so you can get access to all that stuff for free and then maybe stick around for a little bit to help me pay some bills. I'd appreciate it. Speaking of help, thank you to Glenn, Philippa, and Haley for helping me to make this show. You guys are awesome. And to all of you for listening. Oh, I hope you're getting after it in these spring temperatures if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, or the autumn temperatures in the Southern Hemisphere. I'll be heading to Australia in a couple months and experiencing some autumn/winter temperatures. That's exciting. Anyway, more on that soon. I will see you guys in the next episode. And until then, I hope you're getting after it and having an awesome week. I love you.